I'm in the building at the moment of Glasgow City Mission, where I serve as chaplain. So I'm working with homeless people, people affected by addiction, and displaced migrants. That's part of my week. The other part of my week, or of my life, I'm a senior research fellow at the International Baptist Theological Study Centre in Amsterdam. My research interest is the interface between pastoral theology and biblical studies. Hermeneutics for pastoral practice is my passion. I've been invited here to look at this, to respond from a pastoral perspective. It's a great privilege to be invited to do so, and I would like to thank the organisers for that invitation. And the first thing to say is, of course, that this book is a tour de force, and I'm full of admiration and not a little envy, if that's allowed. It's such a fine example of fine scholarship which can be used fruitfully by academics, students, and practitioners alike. I consider myself to be in the last category, as I work, as I've said, as a chaplain to people affected by displacement, migration, homelessness, and addiction in Glasgow. And it's this that will form the background to my response here. A large part of my work as chaplain is to try to help vulnerable, often traumatized and lonely believers find and build community in which their faith can be nurtured and grow. The question I ask myself as I read Steve's commentary, therefore, is how can it help me in this ministry? The book is a superb example of traditional historical critical study, providing in-depth exegetical insights into the Greek text. How can it help support people on their journey of discipleship? I think it's worth noting that in the field of pastoral theology, there are those who think that historical critical study has little or no relevance to their discipline. And in the field of biblical studies, there are some who would discard historical criticism altogether and focus only on contemporary hermeneutics as their way of opening up the text for contemporary communities. And in my view, both are short-sighted. The task may be a complex one, but I believe we have a responsibility to use the insights of historical criticism and contemporary hermeneutics to help us learn from the collection of books which make up the Christian scriptures. And so to the book of Acts itself. Why might studying it be helpful for my community here? The reason is that there are strong similarities between this community's situation and that of the early church. The stories recorded in Acts are stories of new believers who are struggling to understand what it means to be followers of and witnesses to Jesus in a suspicious and often hostile religious and political environment. They come from varied backgrounds and must learn what it means to form a worshipping, faithful community. The same is true for many of the people with whom I work. For them, as for the earliest believers, the commitment to faith has entailed not only embracing religious and cultural change, but in many cases, loss and profound trauma. As I read the stories in Acts, therefore, I'm wondering what we can learn from their experiences, as we learn not only about them as people, but also, as Steve himself notes, about how God is working amongst them and in the world as a whole. Note that I'm not looking to the text to provide me with a template of how to do church, as I've often heard suggested. In fact, I believe the book of Acts itself does not encourage us to look for hidden imperatives as to how the church should be run within its text. As narrator, Luke does not idealize the nascent church, as many modern readers have been tempted to do. Moreover, it's quite clear that their leaders are learning how to lead as they go along, which I find very comforting indeed. This is a warts and all account in which redemption, inclusion, and transformation are strong motives. I am, therefore, seeking to learn from the mistakes as well as the successes, the things they got wrong as well as the things they got right. And in order to do this, I need to try to understand the setting in which they lived, the social circumstances prevailing upon them, and the language and literary techniques that the author of this book uses to tell the tale. And for all this, I need the WPC commentary on Acts. At this point, too, I should perhaps say that as I read, my motivation is not, on the whole, sermon preparation. I'm not a preacher. My preferred method is the contextual Bible approach of Gerald West and others, in which group participants are invited to offer their own ideas about what the text has to say. The people in this community here are not just ordinary theologians, to use Jeff Astley's term. They are marginalised people who tend to have no voice in society in general and in churches in particular. I want them to learn that they can express ideas and opinions in a safe environment. We can explore these ideas and learn together. Now, this can make for some interesting comments, and free speech is encouraged. But thankfully, in contextual Bible study methodology, it is the job of the facilitator to keep discussions grounded, and careful preparation is needed. Part of that preparation is deciding what sections of Acts will be most helpful for this community. The lengthy speeches are not likely to be so significant for them. Instead, I'm likely to choose passages in which personal and community transformation and community life and dynamics are to the fore. For many of our guests, stories such as that of Peter and Paul provide encouragement and the basis of their discussion. For example, it's deeply moving to read that Peter, the former denier, becomes a channel of hope to others. The same goes, of course, for Paul. Steve notes that Calvin refers to his past history of cruelty. This can be the basis of profound healing discussion and be a powerful source of hope for those who come from backgrounds of criminality and imprisonment. God can use even those who have had murderous intent in the past. Further, it may not be immediately obvious that the scholarly debate on whether Paul was converted or called has pastoral implications. But Steve's willingness to say that the two are not mutually exclusive is helpful to those who have left religious communities and are looking to see how they can serve in a new one. If the reader is tempted only to read the explanation section, they will miss some valuable information in the comment. For example, the observation that in 4:13 Luke describes Peter and John as egrammatoi kai idiotai. This sort of detail is invaluable for me as I try to encourage people to think through and understand that they, regardless of their background, have a part to play in God's work in the world, including having a role in calling out dishonesty and hypocrisy on the part of religious leaders. Of particular relevance in my setting is the depiction of daily life of the early community, for example, in chapter 2. This was a life in which meals were shared and goods shared in common. The question arises, in what ways and to what extent ought we to be doing the same? Is there an implied imperative amongst the indicatives? In our individualistic, materialistic society, we might be tempted to think so and conclude that these early believers had hit on an ideal way to live. In his commentary, however, Steve's focus on the community's shared values, rather than the practices themselves, provides once more wise basis for discussion, encouraging us to think about why table fellowship was so important in the first place. What should our attitude towards possessions and money be? What is our attitude to welcoming others? And not least, where is God in all of this? How do we understand him to be at work amongst us? It is helpful, for example, to read that there does not seem to have been a requirement to contribute all their possessions to the common good, in contrast to the Essenes, but that it was an attitude of holding possessions lightly, of making possessions available to others as needed. Helpful too is the socio-historical insight that when Luke writes of sharing possessions, he is speaking of sharing among people from a wide variety of social standings, whereas the Greek or Roman aspirations to sharing were among elite people only. Also important are stories such as the healing at the Beautiful Gate, which help us to think about how God works in the lives of individuals and communities. For our community, the nature of healing is important. What are we to make of these narratives? How do we avoid the risk of assuming that all disability, as we understand the word today, is something that needs to be fixed? And what of those who are not healed? In my experience, focusing on personal healing and making this central to the community's witness can become counterproductive. Steve helps us to take a broader view. He says, the background of people with such disabilities being unable to take a full part in worship suggests that there is a strong restoration of Israel dimension to this story. This bigger picture is helpful in my setting. Discussion can be guided around areas of inclusion and unity under Christ, the scope of evangelism and witness, how we respond to difference, and what it actually might mean to be saved. It should be clear by now that I consider this commentary to be an invaluable tool as I prepare for our contextual Bible study sessions. It provides me with the social, historical, and literary ballast, which is essential for helping me to keep the discussions grounded. We are not the first community to be learning what discipleship means. I appreciate the fact that in the explanation sections, Steve does not universalize, by which I mean he offers not instruction on the basis of what has been discussed, but guidance with a light touch, suggesting themes which might be developed, and in a way which leaves the working out of practical implications of the text to the preacher or practitioner. I have to confess that there's one instance I would like to hear more, and I would appreciate some guidance because I'm stumped, and that's the very strange story of Ananias and Sapphira. Steve writes that the story is a worked example of the principle of sharing possessions. For him, the problem is that Ananias and Sapphira present their gift dishonestly, as a greater contribution than it actually is. Fair enough. But what are we to make of the shocking consequences of the couple's actions, their sudden deaths? Steve, rightly, I think, speaks of the story telling us about the radical view of the holiness of the community and a strong warning against the destructive power of greed. But the question is bound to arise. What kind of God treats people in this way, if in fact that is what is going on? Are we to see this as divine punishment? Further, from a pastoral point of view, Peter's handling of the situation is, I think, questionable. There's not a hint of compassion or concern here for a woman who has just been widowed and she doesn't even know it yet. The harshness of the story is perplexing and troubling, and I would love some discussion of that. This last point notwithstanding, I hope I have made it clear how much I value this commentary. And I hope too that the message to people in pastoral ministry is loud and clear. Don't be tempted only to read the explanation parts of the book. You'll miss out if you do. There's a need for pastoral theologians and practitioners to learn from and engage with the work of biblical scholarship. There has been a temptation amongst pastoral theologians to dispense with Scripture altogether, and amongst some biblical scholars to see little connection between their work and the needs of the church. Thankfully, times are changing, and Steve's commentary is an example of a work which helps bridge the gap between the academy and pastoral practice. I am deeply grateful to him for his work on this commentary. It provides me with an indispensable resource for my pastoral ministry amongst marginalised and vulnerable believers, and I too am looking forward to the next installment.